Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at a Colt Delta Elite, a 10mm service semi-automatic pistol, which means it must be totally awesome. This was in fact only the second production 10mm pistol ever produced. I mean, not the second example gun, the second design. It was introduced in 1987. And it followed closely on the heels of the infamous Bren Ten. The Bren Ten was an idea largely backed by Colonel Jeff Cooper around a new firearms cartridge. It was an evolution of what had been some various Wildcat experimental cartridges. And the original concept here was to have a 200 grain bullet fired at about 1,200 feet per second. 10mm, which is equivalent to 40 caliber. The idea was this would be higher velocity than a 1911, and it would be overall a better service pistol than the 1911. And Cooper got support for this concept from Norma for ammunition, and Dornaus and Dixon company was set up to produce this conceptually ideal automatic pistol. Now I have an entire video on the Bren Ten, so if you're not familiar with it, you should definitely go check it out. The upshot is the Bren Ten was an ignominious failure. However, there was a lot of PR surrounding it and a lot of hype, and this new cartridge was really the hot thing, and a lot of people were very excited about it. And Colt made a pretty slick decision at that time that when the Bren Ten was looking like maybe it wasn't going to do so well, or perhaps even before that, Colt decided to introduce a version of its Model 80 1911 in 10mm automatic, and that was the Colt Delta Elite. This basically follows the exact pattern of the 1911 service government model pistol. It has these distinctive grips. That red triangle was specifically the icon for the Delta Elite pattern. When these were initially introduced, they were available in a couple different patterns. The two common ones were the blued model, like you see here, which had a DE serial number prefix. There was also a stainless model, which has a DS prefix. That allows you to distinguish them from blued guns that have been nickel-plated, for example. And then they also did a gold cup and a match version. Those are much scarcer, and we're not going to get into those today. The frame is the same basic size as the 1911. They didn't have to change that. The magazine, however, does definitely look distinctive. Because it's a 40 caliber cartridge instead of a 45 caliber cartridge, the magazine width is set for 45, the cartridge is narrower, so it has these rails or indents pressed into both sides to help control the 10mm cartridges, keep them right in the center. So magazine capacity is 9 rounds instead of 8 in 45, or possibly 7, depending on your mags, but the magazines are pretty easily distinctive, and of course they're marked Colt 10mm. We then also have a nice distinctive roll marking on the slide, Delta Elite 10mm. They don't want you to mistake that. The controls are all very standard 1911, thumb safety, slide release, basic 3-dot sights, grip safety, single action only, button magazine release. You don't really need me to go over that. This comes apart just like a standard 1911. The design is the same, they've just changed the cartridge, and that's where the problem lies, or the potential problem. So they did have to make a couple of modifications to accommodate this new hotter cartridge, because 10mm is, no question about it, more powerful than 45 ACP. First off, the recoil spring. They replaced the single recoil spring with a double nested recoil spring. So you can see the second one starts right there, goes to the end. There's a little bit of a polymer buffer pad on the back of this. And the idea there is this helps you control slide velocity. This is going to slow down the slide at the end of its cycling. And slide velocity is the big issue for a conversion like this. You have to keep the slide slow enough that it's not slamming into the frame at the end of travel. Now, 1911s with high round counts, especially with full power ammunition, do have a tendency to crack the frames. This doesn't happen a lot, but it is one of those known things. You know, you get a guy who comes in with tens of thousands of rounds through his gun, and it's not uncommon to find a crack having developed in the slide rail right here. And that happened on the Delta Elites much more quickly than it would have on 45s because of the different cartridge. So Colt's solution pretty early in production was simply to cut out this section of the slide rail. So normally on an early gun, you would have this hole is kind of D-shaped at the top, and the slide rail is continuous there. And this was simply a stress accumulation point. So by cutting it out, it's actually a really effective way to avoid the problem. It kind of sounds like a, it sounds like the cheap way to just like hide something and throw a Band-Aid on it. Well, okay, it cracked there, so well, let's cut out that section and then it can't crack there. But in reality, by removing that stress accumulation point, that's a very practical way to do it. And in fact, going forward, the rest of Colt's 1911s would also have this modification. So this isn't uncommon to see in general today, in addition to its application on the Delta Elites. So what we have here is a gun that was fundamentally reliable and safe, but it had a smaller margin of error than a .45 caliber 1911. And on top of that, you have people who decided to really try and push the envelope in ways that most people didn't with a .45. The 10mm auto has this absolute cult following, and people who shoot it, there's a substantial subset of those people who want, who kind of like insist on having absolute atomic loaded 10mm auto. And so they're pushing the envelope on bullet weight and velocity. And they're doing it in conjunction with a gun that has less margin of error for this sort of thing. And then there are a couple other modifications that can also cause further problems. For example, the hammer spring. Remember, this is a single action pistol. So the first thing that has to happen when you fire is the slide has to move back and actually recock the hammer. There's a spring in there. There's not a lot of leverage on this for the slide. This takes a non-trivial amount of effort. So if you are trying to make yourself a better target gun, a more precise gun, and you lighten the hammer spring to get a better trigger pull, well, you're also going to be increasing slide velocity because you're reducing the delay in the slide opening. It's going to get going faster as a result by the time it cycles open, and you're going to increase the wear on your gun. And that's going to result in things like cracked frame, perhaps, or simply broken parts a lot earlier in their lifespan than one would normally expect, either for a stock Delta Elite or for a 1911 in its original .45. So therein, I think, lies the problem. This is partly the gun, but the gun in its stock form is fine with stock ammunition, and most of the ammunition on the market today is loaded a little bit lighter than that 200 at 1200 initial specification for the round. You're much more likely to get things like 180 grain at 1100, cartridges that are a little closer to 40 Smith & Wesson. So if you want a gun more powerful than a 40, this is a decent option. This is a good option, actually. It's a classy gun. It looks like a 1911, but it's got an extra round of capacity, and it is legitimately a 10mm automatic pistol. However, if you want to go out and practice hand cannoneering and developing loads as hot as you can possibly handle in a pistol, perhaps 10mm auto isn't even the best solution for you, and definitely a gun like this isn't. You should go get yourself something like an LAR Grizzly or a Wildy or an Automag and use those to play around with loads that are really too hot for a gun that was designed more than 100 years ago, well more than 100 years ago now. Colt decided to reintroduce the Delta Elite in 2008, and they put them back into production in 2009, and they are still available today with a number of upgrades from this. Nothing really huge, but things like a better beaver tail, better sights, some basic 1911 upgrades. And so if you're interested in a Delta Elite, there's that new pattern available, and then there's also guns like this one that are good examples of the original production series of the Delta Elite. Now, if you'd like more information on this particular one, you can take a look at Rock Island's catalog page that has their pictures and their description, their price estimates, and so on. You can find that yourself, or you can go to the link in the description text below, which will take you to forgottenweapons.com, from whence you can continue on to Rock Island's catalog. Thanks for watching.